see 11:45. So I think that we should promptly begin our final panel, which is going to focus on lessons learned and thinking broadly for the future and systemic reform. I'm going to turn it over to our panelist, Brooke Harris, who is a managing attorney in CGLP's Juvenile Justice Clinic. And Brooke, I'll let you introduce our panelists and run the show.
Thanks, Sean. Thanks, everyone, for being here and for sticking with us. This is our last panel. We have spent the last 2 days talking and hearing from experts about issues impacting crossover youth. And this panel is designed to talk about solutions and steps forward. We have a number of wonderful speakers today, so I'm actually going to introduce them briefly to keep us moving. We have a number of different topics. I would just ask that when each panelist speaks first, that they give everyone their pronouns. I'm not going to do that for you. Mine are she, her, hers. So first, we have our panelists from the Center for Juvenile Law and Policy. We have Samantha Buckingham, who is the director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and clinical faculty. She is an expert in trauma, served as a public defender in Washington, D.C. prior to joining Loyola, where she's been for a number of years and was a high school teacher before that. Megan Stanton-Trahan is the director of our Youth Justice Education Clinic and a powerful force behind this symposium. We all owe her a great big shout out for organizing this and making it as dynamic as it's been. We have two attorneys from the Children's Law Center care team. First, we have Barbara Duey, who is the supervising attorney in the care unit. She has been a lead advocate in the county for dual status youth for over 20 years, and we're thrilled to have her expertise here. Maggie Brandow is another supervisor in the care unit, and she oversees she's in CLC 3, I believe. I always get confused. I'm sorry, Maggie. She oversees her firm's work with dual status mental health and regional center advocacy. We have my friend and former colleague from the Bay Area, Erin Palacios. She is an attorney at the Youth Law Center. Her work seeks to focus on the critical reinvestment of resources required to replace punitive delinquency responses with community-based systems of care. Erin is as knowledgeable as anyone about child welfare laws and how we can use them for our benefit in juvenile delinquency court. We have Ruth Cusick from Public Counsel. She's the supervising attorney for the Statewide Education Rights Unit. She does critical policy work across the state, is an education law expert and a fierce colleague of all of us at Loyola. We have Paul Soak, who is an organizer with the Youth Justice Coalition. He works to dismantle policies causing the massive lockup of people of color, the school to prison to deportation track, and the buildup of the world's largest network of jails and prisons. YJC is another phenomenal organization and a really important partner to us in this work. And last but not least, we have Dr. Corina Constantin-Marconi. She's a licensed clinical psychologist and a clinical supervisor at the Rape Treatment Center at UCLA's Santa Monica Medical Center. She's also in private practice, working with adults and adolescents with complex trauma. She is an absolute expert on trauma and has served as a court-appointed expert on juvenile delinquency cases. So welcome to everybody. We are going to get started. Our first question is for Sam and Megan, and that is just to talk for a bit about our key takeaways from the Everychild project. Either one of you can jump in.
Megan, you want to go first?
Sure. So I'm Megan, she, her, hers. I'll just start by talking about, a little bit about the project. If you haven't read all of our materials, we've been working for 3 years to provide holistic representation to crossover youth in LA County. So juvenile justice advocacy here, as well as education and social work advocacy. And of course, I am the director of the education clinic. So I'll talk a little bit about our sort of takeaways in that space. A few things that I would just start with up front things we probably knew already, but that, are worth saying. Many of our clients that we have represented in this work end up involved in the juvenile justice system because of issues at school. So, again, that's something probably a lot of us already know, but the data from our project really bears that out. So I'll just tell the story of one of our clients. Actually, I think he was my first client here at Loyola. His name, we'll call him Nathan. He was in middle school when he entered the dependency system after the traumatic death of his father that he unfortunately witnessed. And his mother was incarcerated at the time. He was trying to care for his siblings. He was the, I think, second oldest. The school, which became aware of his circumstances, referred him to the child welfare system, but there was nothing done sort of in the school setting to address what was going on. So no counseling or referrals to services like special education or anything like that. So unfortunately, the circumstances took their toll on him, and he ended up getting into a fight at school with somebody when he was triggered by something, and struck a school staff member who was trying to break up the fight, was charged with assault and ended up in delinquency court, and sort of stayed there for a while. He kept being able to fulfill his probation terms, except for school. So he was still having a really hard time with school, wasn't accessing his education. There was still no referral for special education or any other interventions in that setting. And so this just kept him, involved in the delinquency system. Like I said, entered as a middle schooler as a result of a school-based incident. And, also this young man, when we first became involved with his case, he was detained because he had been placed in an emergency shelter after his group home closed. Again, that was no fault of his, right? But he then AWOL'd from that and was detained and put in juvenile hall. So sort of you can see the school was the place where all this started. And then the systems that are supposed to be helping him along the way aren't really intervening as they necessarily should or effectively. So our project really identified his special education needs, got him assessed, got him the services he needed in school. And we also had our social worker help the DCFS social worker liaise there, identify a placement for him so he could go and live in a foster home. And he became stable, and, school remained a difficult place for him. He again picked up a charge at school, but we were there to deal with it. And so that was something important to keep in mind. But the long-term impacts of the school to prison pipeline remain for this population of students. Another key takeaway I would say is that once youth are involved in the juvenile justice system, it's difficult for them to get off probation without obtaining their high school diploma. So a lot of times, even if you have a 14-year-old, and we don't want to keep 14-year-olds on probation forever, right? But what we see oftentimes is we're going to keep them until they graduate from high school. And so what happens there is you have a teenager that, there's things that happen along the way, but when they're being monitored by systems, they're going to keep becoming involved and detained over and over. So I had one client I'll just talk about here. He came to our attention and we started working with him. He wasn't going to school. So his probation officer actually referred him to our clinic by saying, he's not going to school and I don't know what to do. And I was like, oh, okay, well, you're a school-based probation officer. So maybe let's think about what interventions we could do at school to help him figure this out, right? So we intervened, figured out he needed new special education assessments, and started that process. But it's a period of time. It's not right away. It's not immediate. His school-based probation officer continued to violate him, and then he ended up being detained because she came to court to argue for that, unfortunately. So she started off by referring him to us, but then it didn't move quick enough. So that was an issue. And this young man, he continued to struggle in the school environment, but he finally found a really supportive school and he was doing really well. But there was one, violation of probation. And despite the fact that the judge in that case, when he was, considering what to do about this violation, said, okay, well, we're going to remove you from the home, but we want you to stay in your school of origin, noticing that school had been an issue for this young man over the time that, he had been supervising him. The probation department, unfortunately, couldn't find him a placement that was close enough for him to remain in his school of origin. So that was a traumatic experience for him. That school didn't go well at all. When he finally did return home and to his school of origin, he did great. And he graduated from high school. And then he was off probation, right? So anyway, point being, this young man, because of not being able to graduate and therefore be off probation, continued to have violations, even though other things in his life were going pretty well for him. The other thing I'll say, another key takeaway is, what we've been able to do in terms of our advocacy to help our young people that we work with. What are the big things that we do? Get them access to special education services. So about 90% of our clients we found require them, but almost, I think it's around 50% of our clients do not have them when they come to us for in the referral process. So that's a really key thing. Another one, school discipline advocacy. So a lot of our foster youth clients, the one I talked about first, Nathan, he, if we were involved in that initial school discipline incident, we may have been able to divert some of those issues from happening. We've been able to, stop a juvenile justice case from happening because we won an expulsion hearing. So things like that. The other big takeaway, and something I hope, we can all think about and talk about, is this whole issue of keeping kids on probation until they graduate from high school. Because what's that's doing what I talked about before, which is, continuing to keep kids monitored, and that's not great for them, but also it's forcing them almost to take this option of AB 216, which is a minimum state graduation requirements for young people who, are involved in the foster care or the delinquency systems and end up moving, getting changed placements after their second year of high school. So a lot of our clients, because of all the systems moving them around all the time, they qualify for this graduation option, but it allows them to graduate from high school with significantly fewer credits. We always advocate for this for our clients because it's what they want and it's what's best for them at the time. But, I think it's a concern that the system is creating, basically a second diploma for these kids instead of allowing them to stay in the school, in their school of origin or in their placements and have that security. So that's all I'll say for now, just as an intro. I'll let Sam talk about her sort of takeaways and findings.
Thank you, Megan. First and foremost, I'm going to say kids wind up in the dependency and the delinquency system for the same underlying reasons, and they have to do with trauma. They have to do with how that trauma manifests and what we know to be the manifestation of trauma that gets criminalized, punished in the juvenile delinquency system. So how we look at kids is really important because these kids have the same underlying issues, and we really want to be able to help. And help means understanding the underlying issues and understanding that kids wind up in the dependency and the delinquency system because of the same issues that they're facing. Jeanette said something earlier today, Jeanette Lomelli, one of our social workers at the Center for Juvenile Law and Policy, about how kids who are in the delinquency system but don't have any technical dependency court involvement in their past, they still have all the same issues, and they're most likely to have fallen through the cracks and not gotten help. So we're looking at kids, and I think the lens through which we look at them should be the same, whether you're in the dependency or the delinquency system, whether you technically have a history in dependency or not. These are all the same underlying issues, and trauma is very often at the root. Then second thing I'm going to talk about is housing and reentry for kids who are in for kids who have families that are overwhelmed or unable to care for them, or the court deems that they're unable to provide a place for them, housing becomes a real obstacle to getting back into the community. And I think there's a number of ways in which this manifests. One way in particular is a problem we have with suitable placements through the delinquency system. You know, the idea of suitable placement is that if a young person should be able to succeed in the community, but the court doesn't think they have the support and structure in place in their home to succeed, then the philosophy behind suitable placement is we're going to put them in a location where they're going to have that structure and support to be able to succeed in the community. They don't need to be detained in order to punish them. Yet, when a kid is going to be suitably placed, the very first thing that happens is they get taken into detention. And then they sit in detention in the juvenile hall and they wait for a place to open. And to a child, that is received as punishment. Being taken away from your family, being held in juvenile hall, that is received as punishment. So this is something philosophically, suitable placement, that we're doing to, you know, the idea behind it is that we're doing it to try and give a kid a chance at being supported in the community so they can succeed in the community. And that is not at all the message that's received, and that's not at all how it's practically implemented. I've had conversations with the probation department. What is it that we can do to make sure in the future that kids can go from being in the community at home, and if that's not working, to being in a suitable placement in the community without having to go through detention, without using juvenile hall at all. And to me, that's an enormous thing that we can work on as a solution, because it's a huge flaw that kids are sitting in juvenile halls and waiting, and sometimes waiting for months and months and months and not getting the kinds of services they need. And COVID has just put a pin in that. So first, right, was that delinquency and dependency. You've got the same underlying issues. Trauma is at the root. Second, looking at this housing issue in particular, suitable placement. And third, I'm going to talk about reentry. Incarceration in and of itself is traumatic. Being removed from your family is traumatic. And if we want kids to succeed back in the community and not have this problem Megan talked about on the education side of just being supervised by the court until you graduate from high school, and on the delinquency side, you know, it is essential that a kid have the supports that they need and services they need in the community, independent of the probation department, in order for the case to be terminated. So together with not linking high school graduation with the end of supervision, we have to also link other services that are coming from a place other than probation. And incarceration is a complete and utter failure in helping anyone to succeed in the community. I think that reentry services are sorely, sorely lacking, and COVID has just put an exclamation point in that. We have to be able to support young people when they're coming out of facilities, and I think the best way to do it is never to put them in the facility in the first place.
Thank you both. Those are pretty extraordinary takeaways. We're next going to hear from Sam and Barbara and Maggie, Erin and Phal, to learn about what needs to change about the juvenile legal system in Los Angeles. There have been some changes lately, and we'd like to hear about those, but also what we need to continue to push, and anything else that our panelists have. So Sam, I'm going to start with you, and then I'll have Barbara, Maggie, Phal, and Erin speak in that order, if that works for everyone.
Thanks, Brooke. So not surprisingly, we need to change what we're doing with suitable placement as a very practical, takeaway. We have a lot of work to do there. We can dramatically reduce incarceration if we improve the way that we transition young people into suitable placements. But more than that, we need to provide support and services to kids and their families in their home, in the community, without removing them from their home. Removing children from their families is inherently traumatic, and we can provide more services in the community, we can prevent, going into the system in a deeper way and tearing apart families if we support people more in the community, and that's family, and that's kids. And I think we need to do so in a way that shores up the resilience and capabilities of each of the individuals, the kids and their families. And this, really builds on something I said earlier today about, the way that we communicate with people has an awful lot of power, no matter what the setting is. And we should always be looking. This is something our students do. It's a part of how we advocate. Should always be looking for what we can say that's positive. Even when we know someone has made a mistake and we might be going into a probation hearing where they're trying to revoke a probation or say they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, we're thinking, what can we give them credit for? And that's something that everyone has to have as a mindset. What can we do to shore up the strengths of our clients, of the kids who are going through these systems, and their families? And I think we need to work really, really hard on reentry. We really need to reduce as much incarceration as absolutely possible, and work to make sure that kids are going to have services in place. The kids who I have seen going in and out of facilities of incarceration during COVID are the example of what happens when the services aren't in place and you're just, getting released and the support isn't there, when we know that you need specific types of therapy and it's just not available to be delivered. The kids are the ones who bear the brunt of that, because they're the ones who, if they don't have what they need, are going to risk being potentially rearrested. And it's a dramatic unfairness that is so baked into our system. The systemic and structural problems of racism and inequity are so, I think, highlighted at this point in time during the pandemic. And so it's something we've really got to work on and examine. And in order to address it, I think we have to dramatically reduce incarceration as even an option that we consider.
Just taking from what Sam said, we need a complete shift in how we're looking at these kids. And the really exciting thing is that LA seems to be, ready to do that. I mean, it seems across the board, the Board of Supervisors, the Youth Justice Work Group, all of that was acknowledging the science, the brain development, understanding that our kids, until they're, mid to late 20s, are still developing. We need to go from punishing the kids to healing them. We need to get kids out of cages. We need to look at them much more holistically. And the Youth Justice Work Group, what was really amazing about those groups of people that came together is we had so many young adults with lived experience who sat at the tables alongside presiding judges and CEOs and chief of probation, telling us what they needed and what they didn't get. And what they needed was someone, to care about them, to help them develop, to help them be healthy, to teach them how to move forward. And I think Sam was also right about, these group homes are just a terrible placement for kids. It's not a natural experience. It is you're putting together not only teenagers, but teenagers who have multiple layers of complex trauma. I agree that all our kids, whether they start out as foster kids or not, have a lot of the same problems. But what we know about dual status youth is that they came into the system because they were abused, abandoned, or neglected by their parents. So they have that trauma. Then they have the trauma of being separated because of that occurrence. They were a victim, and yet they are the one that lose their family, their friends, their community, their school, anything that was in their life. They just get plucked up and put somewhere else. And that's when, their trauma starts, you have trauma behavior, and, we are literally criminalizing it. I've talked a lot about, when you're in a home, if, you got brothers and sisters and you get an argument in the home and somebody throws something and a window breaks and somebody gets, hurt, the kids are going to get grounded, or they're going to get some sort of, not get their allowance, but our kids get thrown in cages and charged with felonies. And then we have the same problem that's already been mentioned, is that they're kept on probation until they're 18, because the judges want to see them do well. And yet we put them in a situation where it's pretty impossible for them to do well. I think we've had some great victories and successes. Starting with our district attorney, whose new filing guidelines has changed things a lot dramatically. I think we've had more cases dismissed in the interest of justice. And again, these are the type of cases where we have kids living in congregate care and having conflict. That is not a criminal matter. I think we need to continue to push forward in diversion through the youth development, youth YDD. That has been a tremendously successful program, and anything we can do to steer kids away from penetrating deeper in the juvenile justice system, the better. So I can talk about some successes, but I think I let other people go and maybe come back to me if we have time.
Yeah, I agree with Barbara that we're seeing a lot of hopeful things, a lot of successes. Barbara mentioned the increased use of diversion. We're really seeing that among CLC clients. We're seeing clients who are involved in incidents that would in the past have led to criminal cases, to charges in the delinquency system, and now those charges aren't being filed. And that's really hopeful and really exciting. But at the same time, some of these cases are still really slipping through. And I think one thing that I think about a lot is our system really reflects a profound lack of empathy towards our youth, towards our families. And we've talked about it a lot today in terms of the fact that all of these kids, dependency, delinquency, they're the same kids. They're from the same trauma, the same backgrounds of abuse and neglect. And I think that so often we hide behind procedures, statutes, policies, and we don't look at these kids and families with an empathetic human heart. We look at a statute or a procedure. We learned of a case yesterday, a child who was arraigned in one of our juvenile justice courts yesterday. She just turned 13. She was found in a motel room with an adult male, weapons, ammo, and meth, and a couple of other teenage girls. She was arrested, and she is currently sitting in juvenile hall. Think of how many adults have touched that case in the last 72 hours, and how many adults let it go right by, so that there's a 7th grader sitting in juvenile hall right now when she was clearly the victim in that situation. That situation is screaming sex trafficking. And now DCFS has decided, no, they don't need to open a case for this client. So she's going to sit in the hall. So where we've gone wrong in being able to go, well, but her situation meets these elements of this statute, or now we have to follow this procedure that we've come up with in our system when there's a situation like this. Instead of being able to step back and go, this is a child who just turned 13, was clearly in harm's way. How then can we extricate her from this situation instead of allowing her to be further harmed? Think of the trauma she already had, and now that trauma is compounded by multiple nights in juvenile hall. So I think that we somehow have been able to insulate ourselves as humans from the pain and from the empathy, and we just follow our procedures and we follow our statutes and hide behind them. I think that's something Gascon is trying to stop doing. And it's pretty remarkable, isn't it, the pushback he's getting. But that's something that I hope we can continue to see as time goes on, is more ability to empathize and have compassion and really in a human way step back and go, what are we doing here? And are we doing more harm than good?
Yeah, for sure. That's pretty pretty real there. Paul with YJC, he and his. I actually want to take us on a little bit of a different trip then, since kind of the conversation has gone this way. The system people often think of it as being broken. I want to encourage people to think that it functions the way that it was meant to and designed to work as. It was designed to be punitive.
Mhm.
It was not designed to be healing. It was not designed to resolve harms, resolve issues in communities. It was just designed in such a way that you take a human body, treat it as a widget in the supply chain, and you put it in a concrete box and store it so you can profit off of it somehow, and capitalize off of people, right? And oftentimes, you know, there was this fortune cookie I cracked. This is crazy. I'm not gonna lie. It said, society prepares the crime, the criminal just commits it. That's specifically what this fortune cookie said. And I was across the street from the probation office, the headquarters. I was going there for a meeting. I went to go grab some food. I got a fortune cookie, and that's what it said. I was like, man, I got to get out of this place. I'm good. I got to leave here. But I wanted folks to think about that, right? I want folks to think about when this land was colonized. And I say land because I want to differ it from country, which is a system of borders. And I want to dissect that away from the nation, which is the people that kind of fill up the country, right? So let's think about things, compartmentalize it. When this land was colonized and folks wanted to finally establish the United States of America, the first act that Congress did to say who was the benefit said that it was the free white person. That was the person, right? You can look it up, Naturalization Act of 1790. It's there. First act of Congress, right? Who was meant to benefit from all the things that they created, all the things that they built, their independence that they fought for, whatever. It was for the free white person. They didn't think about the black folks that they were using, enslaving them and kidnapping from Africa. They weren't thinking about any of that. They weren't thinking about the indigenous folks that were here. They thought about free white men, right? So this is what it's really built to be around. And if you want to think of policing, it goes back to slave patrols, right? When black folks were trying to just get away and just trying to find some liberty and freedom, they sent people out to go look after them, took their dogs or whatever, right? To try to like hunt people down to bring them back because they were treated as a white man's property. Right. And those are the things that have been part of the system all historically. And that's why we're in a place that we are in today. Policies take time, right, to kind of change and shift. But if things have been happening for like 200 years, it's going to take a lot longer to break things apart, right? You can pick up a habit in a matter of days. How long does it take to break it? It takes a very long time. And we're talking about systems, bureaucracies, right? So I want to encourage folks to think beyond a little bit about that, right? I want to wrap up with this piece right here. Between the mid 1800s and 1980, there were 12 prisons in the state of California. By 2000, California had access to roughly 40 facilities, not only in the state of California, but also out of state. That's how big it grew in just a matter of a short period of time, comparatively, right? And during that same period of time, there were like 4 campuses, university campuses that were built. It was like 3 CSUs and 1 UC, I believe. They built more prison beds than they did desks for higher education. So that's what you get. And so we really have to analyze these things. We have to deconstruct all of this and break it down and try to figure out where do we go from here, right? How do we move away from that mold? But yeah, I don't want to take up too much time because I can go on this conversation forever and ever and ever, but for sure.
Hi, well, I'm Erin from the Youth Law Center, she, her, hers. I think that's kind of a nice place to pick up because I think one of the things that we fail to acknowledge on a kind of daily basis, though many of us know it, is that the system's just deeply racist. And most of the time when we're looking at the data about race, it shows things that are not necessarily alarming, but because we expect them at this point, but we don't figure out how to use them and change them, right? So I just read a report in another county where they went through their SB 823 plan and they came up with all of their race and disparity data, and then they moved on. And I didn't ever say how they were going to address the problem that's in there. And I think that's what we struggle with at its root every single day. Because if we think of some of the things that systems talk about doing to help kids, things like we're going to help you have pro-social activities. We're going to give you lifestyle coaching. We're going to give you life skills. What the heck does that mean? Isn't that very culturally specific? And doesn't there have a lot of tones of being ethnocentric and how you apply those terms? So I think we have to own that and actually talk about it a lot more and more uncomfortably in courtrooms, which brings me to how do you do system change at an individual case level? I think there's lots of ways to do that right now, particularly in the crossover work that a lot of people are doing. And I just want to say that I think there's some differences in California in which we have the crossover population that would sort of be the understood crossover population. And I'm sorry if I seem to be wiggling today, it's because my back is out, so I'm trying to adjust. The crossover population can mean either young people who have a dependency and move into delinquency or vice versa, and that's sort of the typical crossover population that we think of nationally. But California also has, I think, a much broader crossover population because we have overlaid our child welfare system in order to receive money, because a lot of times it comes down to money. And knowing that is important because it can change your arguments to get what you actually want. And then we placed it across the entire delinquency system to leverage those funds. In order to do that, we wrote in the child welfare laws and obligations to the entire delinquency system. So what does that mean? It means we have a lot of opportunities to force individualized planning. And there's absolutely no one system fix that will work for every kid, right? You always hear, well, this kid did really well in a group home. Well, that doesn't mean group homes are good, right? This young person did really well in this particular mentoring program. It doesn't necessarily mean that's a great program, right? It depends on what that young person needs, what that family needs, and that's what should be there. So I think we're a long way from doing that, right? We don't do individual planning for every young person, but the law requires it, right? From the moment of a case being filed and there being a 628 investigation in California, probation is required. And by the way, it doesn't have to be probation. They could contract with an agency that does this better and should, because they do not do it well. So they should contract with somebody who knows what they're doing, a community-based provider, because these kinds of individual plans should be done by credible people in the community in which these children live. Right, so they should be doing this planning. They should be doing it in the child and family team model, which is obligated by law. Nobody does that. Nobody does it with fidelity when they do it, but we know when they do that, it increases the likelihood of children returning to their families. And when children can't return, of them going to a family-based setting. Another way I think we can do that is to challenge reasonable efforts. And that happens a lot more in the child welfare arena, but those reasonable efforts are written into the delinquency code as well. It is not reasonable to take a kid and put them in jail and do nothing to try to help their family be ready to and prepared to bring them home. That is unreasonable by definition. So doing things, putting all of the services that you might think of as dispositional services, they are all required and entitled at the beginning of a case. And the other couple of things that I mentioned, like emergency and temporary placements, I love the point of you shouldn't have to go to detention to get a suitable placement. Not only that, it's legally not allowed for a young person to be brought to detention absent a violation if they've been suitably placed. They should be going to another suitable placement. So there needs to be a plan for what are you going to do if a child loses that placement, say in the night, and needs to go somewhere else, because detention isn't the option under the welfare code. And we also need to use more robustly the thought of like therapeutic homes, particularly for young people who are exploited. We somehow think of them as not able to be anywhere, that they're not going to be contained in a locked facility. But that isn't what we do for victims of trauma, right? That isn't what we would do for a DV survivor. And it isn't what we should do for a child victim, right? There's a program in Florida. I can't believe Florida does something that I'm excited about, but where they have a particular program to use foster homes for children who are exploited. It's been very successful. They do not have the AWOL problem that we pretend is inevitable here. So I just would say, I think we could be really robust in thinking about how to use these. And we should really hone in on individual planning and hold probation to the fire and doing it right. And if they can't do it, then bringing in community advocates who can.
Thank you all for some hard and really necessary truths. And Erin, you're setting us up for our next question, which is for Paul and Dr. Constantin. What needs to change about the probation system in Los Angeles to assure better outcomes for crossover youth? And we're going to have Paul's going to take a sort of global look, and then Dr. Constantin is going to talk again about this thread of suitable placements, which is a really big issue. So, Paul, why don't you start us off by talking big picture and Youth Justice Reimagined and your views, and then we'll go to Dr. Constantin.
Yeah, for sure. I don't want to take away from any work that's being done, right? But I also want to remind folks that what we do, it's often not enough, nowhere near it. And I want to say that because when I was 17, much like folks have already said, I ended up in the system, right? And this was in the 90s. And if you're still hearing stories about that today, like not much has really changed, right? We may see some improvements here and there, but overall, the system is still doing kind of the same rigmarole. right? So I was a young person, went to school for help and got pushed out, right? You hear these stories over and over, still occurring today. I got pushed out. Where did I end up going? End up on the streets because I didn't have nowhere else to go. I didn't have a youth center down the street. I didn't have anywhere to go. The only thing that was waiting for me outside was a man with a badge and a firearm telling me to sit down on the curb, lift up my shirt, and trying to ask me for tattoos I do not have. That's the same stuff that's almost still happening today. And so the reality is things are still going on. But I want to say that because from there, I ended up going into like the system, right? From one system designed for young people, I end up getting sent to an adult system designed for older people. So here I'm a young person inside of an adult system. And then at the end of the day, when it's time for me to get out because of legislation folks fought for that gave me an opportunity to get out because I wasn't born here, I honestly don't get to walk out the gate. I get to watch people go home, but then I get picked up by somewhere else. And off I go into a whole nother journey without representation and all this other stuff. I don't want to go into there. That's a longer conversation for another time. But the big picture is that the probation system is just kind of a cog in all of that. But it's not only a cog, it's also the initiator of how a lot of folks end up getting trapped in that system. It's that initial contact as a young person that kind of pushes folks away and makes things more difficult. The probation system in and of itself, for me, I would say we need to dismantle it. We need to just tear it apart and break it down. Like it just needs to get buried and put away somewhere, right? Because when we think about, as a young person, you're not born into this world. Any 2-year-old, right? You look at 2-year-olds. Let's just talk about that for a second. Do you see a 2-year-old walking around with a knife or gun, go and hurt somebody? A 2-year-old would literally climb every shelf that they can to feed somebody because they see them hungry next to them. That's what 2-year-olds do. I challenge you to find a 2-year-old that wouldn't do that, right? People are born inherently to love and care for one another, right? But the way that we treat people, the way that systems treat people, particularly probation, et cetera, because they're supposed to be looking after young people, but look at the way they're treating them. They're treating them with badges. They're treating them with cages and lockups. That's not love and care. That's like harm. That's hurt, right? And we all understand that the things that young people go through, it gets traumatizing, right? It sears their memory. It's serious stuff. It has impacts. I tell people all the time, I never walked into that system and walked out without some psychological damage. That just doesn't happen. The way I went in was not the way I came out. And folks are like, well, you're doing great today. But you know why I'm doing great today, though? I want to tell people, it's not because of the system. It wasn't because of a badge. It wasn't because of the pro board. It was because of folks that fought really hard to volunteer to go inside and talk about restorative practices, to talk about transformative practices. Folks that went in and engaged me, regardless of who I was, they didn't care about who I was or what. They were just like, man, you're here. Let's just talk. Let's just have a conversation. It was about human to human contact. And it's about connection, about growth, as talking about empathy and talking about people to people, right? And so the bigger picture of things, I think for me, from my end, is we have to go beyond a lot of all that stuff, right? We have to think way beyond and past that. We have to break it down and we have to reimagine the whole entire system. And folks that just oftentimes you just think about LA. I want to say, don't just think of LA in a bubble. And I say this because I have folks that came to visit from the UK and they say, man, when they start looking at policies and stuff, they're looking at California, particularly LA. They say, man, we have gang databases out here. And they're like, yes, we also have it out there. They're called matrices, but they're the exact same thing. They function the same way. And where did they get the idea? They got it from LA. Right. And so LA, the things that we do here have capacity to change California and have capacity to change the world. Right. We have capacity to really move to something more transformative. But I mean, we can go on a really, really long and deep conversation, but man, I wish I could, but anyways.
To pick up from you over there, Paul, the system, can definitely, we've heard stories where it's improving, but it can definitely be, damaging. I liked what I heard from, a number of panelists today in terms of looking, at the youth, looking at the person in front of you as a whole person in a humane way. And that's unfortunately not what happens a lot of the times, right? To illustrate, I'll talk a little bit about a case which I did an evaluation as a youth who I recommended to be placed in a therapeutic residential facility, specifically Vista Del Mar. And I recommended, the residential locked facility for this youth, particularly because we've struggled with suitable placement. And this youth had been in various group homes, again, transfer from group home to group home, and had triggers happened and other abuse happened, and she ran away from placement to placement. So looking at a place where she can have, evidence-based treatment, she can, she can look at, there be therapists where she can get services for trauma that she suffered throughout her life. We looked at Vista Del Mar. And I participated in one of the screenings. I believe there were 3 screenings. And I was quite shocked by the way the screenings, were conducted, and the way that, this youth was just a name on a piece of paper. Again, not looking at the strengths, at the positives, as you, Sam, had mentioned earlier. These are protective factors. And getting to know the youth over, the course of the evaluation, I found a lot of strengths in this particular youth. However, nobody asked, about the youth at all, or about my recommendations. Why did I believe that this person would benefit from a therapeutic environment, where there would be a therapeutic school in place as well, where she would have in-person support. And it would, mainly it was focused on what was on a piece of paper from the probation, officer. And that was an allegation that she was somehow involved in a gang, non-founded allegation. And once that was heard, it seemed like the case was completely dismissed. Quite unfortunate. And the body of research out there that, looks at the prevalence of trauma in these youth that are involved in the justice system was completely overlooked. So having a better way to look again at the youth as a whole person, and looking at what their needs might be, rather than just detention, would be a great opportunity.
Thank you both so much. Megan and Ruth are going to lead us through a discussion about what needs to change in the education system in Los Angeles to assure better outcomes for crossover youth. And I just want to make a note for our attendees that the anonymous client stories that we're sharing, we do have permission to do that, and we want to honor that these are real children that we're talking about, and we're using their stories. We note it to illustrate these points, but there are beautiful people behind that.
Thanks, Brooke. So I'll talk about a few things, and then I'm sure Ruth will have more that she wants to add as well. I think, a few things that I really want to focus on, special education is a big part of our practice for our clients. And, what we know is that system was created to serve students that are experiencing discrimination and school pushout. And unfortunately, it's still existing today. I would say the special education system doesn't necessarily work for our clients the way it should, and it certainly doesn't work for those who don't have the means to hire a private attorney every time they want to do something. So, while I would definitely support universal design principles overall, making sure that schools are addressing the needs of all students and not practicing ableism, I think, if we are continuing to operate in the system that we're in now, we definitely need to have some special education reforms that especially keep in mind the historic inequities and the lack of access that the legal system affords to our crossover youth clients, as well as, low income clients generally, because this system, continues to fail our clients. So a few things, I think that are a huge issue that I'll just get specific on real quick. Assessment timelines for special education, they don't work when kids are getting moved around to all these different schools all the time. We have so many clients that they're getting delayed because they get moved. Something needs to be done about that to address that problem so that we can actually get those assessments done and get services, for kids as quickly as possible and get the discipline protections they need through the IDEA. Another thing I'll know that we've seen in our practice, specifically around why, special education doesn't work for our clients is, there's violations of the law that go back many, many years, and there's really no way to address them unless you have somebody who's aware of that and who can do it at the time. Statute of limitation of 2 years is not long enough, especially for these kids who have to, again, move all the time and change schools. And school discipline, I hope Ruth talks about this a little bit, but these practices, in particular for foster youth, they have the highest suspension rates out of any other group in the state of California. And students with disabilities and Black youth also have really high suspension rates. If you combine those together, you're going to get even higher. So we really need to stop removing young people from school in general, and that's needs to be replaced by more restorative practices in schools. I'll also just quickly say, I talked about school stability a lot in the beginning. I think that's really important as we think about, moving back to in-person schooling when that does occur. We need to keep kids in the same schools as much as possible, unless they or their education rights holders do not want to stay in those schools. But continuing to move kids over and over again causes them to lose years and years of instruction every time. So we need to really get serious about school stability. And that includes not removing kids from their schools in the community and putting them in detention facilities. And so, the last thing I'll say is another way, sort of policy approach to dealing with this issue of school pushout, making sure that, the school districts and the comprehensive schools are held responsible for pushout. We can't let them continue to say, oh, we don't want this kid in our school. We're going to move them somewhere else. We're going to put them in that alternative setting, or we're going to, call the police on them. They need to be held accountable for that. So that's all I'm going to say for now. Ruth, you take it away.
Great. Thank you, Megan. And it's a pleasure to be with all of you. Again, my name is Ruth Cusick. I use she, her pronouns. And while I have over a decade of direct service experience in school discipline defense and education access for students with disabilities, I come to this county work as a movement lawyer, and I've worked with Paul, others at YJC and Arts for Healing and Justice Network and Children's Defense Fund on a project the last 3 years that we're calling the Story Mapping Project, where young people have been interviewing each other, working with their own families to map their histories and their stories around school dehumanization that led them into the juvenile court system. Megan talked about accountability for our comprehensive school districts. And as Paul said, these systems are doing exactly what they have meant to do. The Los Angeles County Office of Education trains our county school districts on positive behavior support and restorative justice, and then does nothing when all of our districts send young people into county alternative schools or creates any structures of accountability with our districts. This has to be a county problem. If it is not a county problem, we will never solve it. And thanks to Paul and so many others that fought for the Youth Justice Work Group being created, we are beginning to unpack all of that. But as part of our story mapping project, we did a Public Records Act request to the LA County Office of Education about all these questions. when young people come out of the halls and camps, do you know why they got there if it's school-based? Do you actually know if they succeed? We asked those same questions to the probation department on school-based violations. We got nothing. So now we have to decide, should we litigate a Public Records Act request to these county departments when they're doing presentations at commissions and to us all, sharing anecdotes about the amazing work that they're doing to change young people's lives? And it's BS, as we know. So I think that's what I would share in this space. That while we are, cadre parents, YJC, so many folks are fighting at the district level to face implicit bias and white supremacy in our schools. But if we do not make this revolving door around alternative ed and criminalization a problem for our whole county, and we have to get creative. Yes, the county doesn't have direct legal jurisdiction over our districts, but that's what Youth Justice Reimagined, I think, is beginning to do, and unpack all of that. Thank you.
Thank you both. Okay, Barbara, Maggie, and Erin are going to talk about what needs to change in the child welfare system in Los Angeles County to ensure better outcomes for crossover youth. And I'll let Maggie start.
Great, thank you. I have 3 thoughts on this question. It's such a big question. I could have 47 thoughts, but I'm going to limit it to 3 that I see most often regarding the dual status population that we're working with right now. One, obviously, biggest problem probably is the child welfare system wanting to dump the kids into the probation system, wipe their hands, say, not our problem anymore. This is your problem now. They literally come to court, to the juvenile justice courts to say that, to say, there's nothing else we can do for him. We've done everything we can. You go for it. So that's one of the biggest problems, is that attitude and that perspective that causes them to constantly try to push these kids over and leave them behind. Second, one of kind of a more constructive thing to bring up is that so many of these kids, when they're getting out of custody, for example, and transitioning, let's say we were lucky enough to find a foster home or a relative for them to live with. When they transfer into that placement, there are no services there to assist them and support them. It can take weeks to get services in place. Well, guess what happens during those weeks? It all falls apart. Or there's the client leaves placement, or there's a probation violation and they get picked back up again and put back in custody. So we need in-home supports, for example, wraparound services, teams that are more nimble and able to meet the client on the spot the day they walk out of custody into the home, rather than putting them somewhere and basically setting them up for failure because we don't give them any supports within a reasonable amount of time. And third, I want to bring up the huge problem when it comes to non-minor dependent clients. So these are youth who turn 18. DCFS's attitude towards these youth is basically, well, they're an adult now, so they need to figure it out. So let's say this is a client who's been in custody for a year or in camp for 9 months. They turn 18, they come out, and DCFS, if the client gets back into DCFS's care, and they say, well, they're 18, so they need to learn how to fill out these applications on their own. Or the social worker will say, well, I handed him 3 applications for housing programs. He didn't fill them out. Do we expect our 18-year-olds to know exactly what to do the minute they have a magical birthday? They don't know what to do necessarily, and especially if they've lived in congregate care settings or grown up in the foster care system. So DCFS has this attitude that they turn 18, and yes, while we keep them on our dime, we don't need to assist them in really proactive ways. We've had this happen to so many of our non-minor dependent clients, kids who are literally on the street, homeless, because DCFS has not assisted them in finding housing. So, and what ends up happening is it's like the department is waiting for them to get arrested again or get hospitalized, and then they've got a bed. So what are we going to do for this population of young adults? it's no surprise they're finding themselves homeless. And we've got to figure out how to work with DCFS to put a real focus on these young people. There's no TSC, transitional shelter care facility, for non-minor dependent males. They don't have beds for them. And that's what they're telling us now, especially with the pandemic. Many of the housing programs for 18 to 21-year-olds, the 21-year-olds are not leaving those programs because they've been allowed to stay longer because of the pandemic, as well they should. But that means there's no room for the 18-year-olds who are coming up. So there's a huge crisis in terms of a lack of beds, a lack of placements, and then a lack of will by the department to really support them in walking through this process of trying to find a place to live. So that's a really needy population, and one that we feel like we see them make some progress and then they turn 18 and it all falls apart. And we don't want that to happen.
Wow. Okay. Thanks, Maggie. Good thing there's a lot of changes needed, because I have a couple to say as well. We've talked a lot about congregate care, and it just seems for our teenagers, and most specifically for our dual status youth, that's where they end up. And these group homes or SDRTPs are not meeting our youth's needs. They just aren't. And our kids are constantly under a microscope, and they're not getting parenting. And, I was going to mention too, the 17 to 18 transition. I mean, I have a kid that was on probation, and he was in an SDRTP, and he wasn't even allowed to walk to the store until he turned 18, when he got his probation terminated. And then he was supposed to have, found an apartment, gotten a job, and he was already in school. The social worker was like, well, they're an adult now, they need to do this. And Maggie's absolutely right. It's just, they really need to start all of that much earlier in that year. But I think going back to the congregate care, these are just not appropriate places to be. And I think one of the biggest problems that DCFS, part of their attitude is this feeling that dual status youth in group homes have to earn their way into a foster home. And I just can't think of anything more crazy than that. I mean, to have to, earn a place in a home. And what the social workers say, well, you have to run a good program in the group home in order to get to a foster home. And again, we've talked about these group homes. There's a lot of conflict. The staff are young. I don't think many of them have much training. There's no adults in the room. There's no parents in the room. Our kids need parenting and love, and, we can't give them those two things, but we can at least, give them, an appropriate place to live. And I think the problem with DCFS is once a foster youth gets arrested and has been in juvenile hall, there's this shame, blame, judgment attached to this youth. And suddenly that youth goes from being a foster youth with all of these traumas and problems to a person who committed an act. And that act, whatever it might be, follows them wherever they go. They're referred, that's the kid that, carjacked, or that's the kid that lit something on fire. And that's, that just follows them. So that really needs to change. I think that one of the best places we could come up with for these kids are a program called Itfc, Intensive Therapeutic Foster Care. And what I know about that is that was a evidence-based program. It was developed for probation youth, and it's supposed to be, a foster home with only one or two foster youth, and either veteran foster parents or professional foster parents who want to work with teenagers, and especially, teenagers in the probation system. I don't know of any in LA. I mean, I had a client that was placed in ITFC years ago, and they gave a notice after 3 days. And of course, another part of the ITFC was no notices. So that needs to change as well. DCFS has got to develop better and more placements. Even for, again, with our 18-year-olds, we have transitional housing is pretty much it. We've started to see some different types of alternative housing popping up that could be helpful. One of them is called Seed House in Chatsworth. If you guys want to check it out, it's SEED. And it's a very, very supportive small home group. And those types of placements are much better for our transition age youth who need a little bit more flexibility and understanding as they, kind of fall into being an adult. I think the last thing I will say is that, I've been actually working in child welfare and juvenile justice in LA for 35 years and at CLC for 30 years. And from day one, what we have complained about in dependency is this kitchen sink approach to every family, every youth, where we get a case plan that, we could all say what's in the case plan right now. We all know it. And it's the same services, the same set of services for just about every family with just slight changes. And I've seen groups come together to come up with individualized, tailored plans. It's never stuck. It's never worked. So that's something else we really need to do. And I have to say that the new diversion community-based organizations have shown to have the creativity and flexibility and empathy and understanding to work with our youth. And I think more of that would help. So I think whoever's next, Ruth or.
I think I'm up next. And I think one of the things that always strikes me as important to do when we talk about the child welfare system is to step back and remember what the child welfare system is supposed to do, which is to replace a parent. And that can't be done. Right. And I know when I say that, parent means different things to a lot of different people because the experience of a parent is so varied. But if we think of the sort of quintessential concept of a parent, the good parts, right? That's what the system is supposed to be replacing, and it can't be done. So what it needs to do is find the person who can most closely replace that for that child if they can't get home to their parent, because it's that relationship and that person who actually cares about them that is going to do the work. It's not actually going to be the system. So every time I think about what I'm doing in a case or what I'm doing in the system, my question always comes back to my own kids. Would this be good enough if my kid landed here? And the answer is no. Every time I look at the system, no. If my kid went to any one of these places, I would be in despair. I'd have to be sedated to stop coming for that kid, right? Because this would be unacceptable. So the only thing that might be acceptable is like, if I'm gone, my sister, right? So those are the kinds of like somebody else who might step in to care. And that's what we're looking for. And I think we need to fundamentally recast how we think about adolescence in child welfare. We've done a decent job, not good, decent job of thinking about that for 0 to 3. It's a critical period. So many things happen. That's true in adolescence too, right? We've learned in recent research that actually adolescence is a time to ameliorate the effects of past trauma. So not only are we doing harm, but we are wasting one of our last real opportunities to ameliorate the harm already done. And so when I hear people say, nobody wants this adolescent, adolescents are hard to place. I just don't believe it. I don't believe there's nobody in that child's life who, given appropriate support and appropriate help, wouldn't want to have that child. These are not throwaway people. There's no such thing. They're children. And adolescents can be annoying, right? We were all annoying ourselves as adolescents. My kids will be annoying too, but they are loved. And there is somebody who wants them. And I think in family finding, we do a very poor job with adolescents. We don't look for the people who care about them, but they're out there. And we have to go back into their own communities, and we have to rethink what it means for them to be in the right place, because the right place is different for everybody. And it might not look like our home looks, right? That might not look like what the little brochure package looks like, but it's right for them. And it's certainly better than a group home. And the one other thing I will say is, I think that when we talk about group homes, sometimes young people say, I was okay there, it worked for me. And what they're really usually saying is they found somebody who helped them along inside that place. And there's a young woman there's a video on YLC's QPI website with this young woman speaking, and she talks about all the things she's done. She's a Berkeley graduate. She's got a master's degree. She's graduated. She's doing all of these things. She has her own place. And she says, basically I'm a success story out of a group home. And then at some point she stopped and she said, but I would trade all of that to have lived that part of my childhood with somebody who cared. And I just kind of blew up when she said that, because it reminded me that all of the kind of boxes we check are insufficient, when what we really need to be helping young people within this age group and all kids is to find their person, because that's where the work's done.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Meg. There are some statewide policy gaps for kids, and I know that Paul and Erin and Maggie and Barbara are working on those statewide gaps. I'm actually going to start with Erin because she has sort of a bird's eye view with her work at Youth Law Center. So Erin, if you want to touch on AB 12 or competency or both, and then Paul, you can jump in, and then Barbara, and then Maggie.
I think we have a real equity problem between the two systems. We sort of theoretically recognize when we remove kids in the child welfare system that we owe them some amount of support down the road with AB 12 and extended foster care. We do a poor job, and we have a case filed right now in Alameda County for a young woman who was homeless when she lost her housing. And we're talking with young people across the state about the same issue right now, which is pervasive. But making sure that that right even extends to young people from the delinquency system is really hard. It does for young people, but a young person who goes to camp and a young person who might not have reached the dispositional phase, it doesn't. We've corrected some parts of that in child welfare, but not all. So even the legal entitlement is a problem, and that's going to be a huge state price tag, because that doesn't come from the federal government and it doesn't even come from the same state pot. So we have to get some political will for people to recognize that these young people are still just young people, right? They're not, that they have inherent value and should be given resources to grow up. For kids in competency proceedings, we seem somehow comfortable letting them sit in detention for really long periods of time because of the fact that they might not be competent. And that is, to me, nuts, right? The very fact that they're sitting in a competency proceeding is a reason they should never be in a detention center. No kid should, but this is even worse. And getting them out, I mean, Brooke did some great work on this issue, I think, and showing a court that there's other options during those periods of time, and making those options robust, but then also figuring out what you're doing on the other side. And one other piece I think that's a big statewide gap is just finding a way to do most of the planning on the front end. And I say planning, I know we've all seen case plans and they're garbage, but they don't have to be garbage, right? The fact that they're always there and stapled to a packet and that's what we get doesn't mean that's what we should get in the future. And there's ways in the law to try to push that and to require, say, a child and family team planning event to actually be made up of the young person's people and community, because they are much more likely to create a good plan and they are much more likely to follow through with it. So making a CFT actually the utilized model and then doing it with fidelity to that process, I think is critically important. So those are a couple of gaps we're working on.
Yeah, for sure. The state is its own animal, its own beast. It's its own bureaucracy in many ways, unfortunately. But I want to say for the state, a lot of the young folks that we work with have been like profiled. They have been labeled. They have been pushed out of schools, right? A lot of those because of policies that are set at the state, right? Like gang databases, for example. Young folks get swept up in there and all of a sudden they're labeled. Now they're getting harassed, getting profiled, getting pulled over, stuck on gang injunctions. There's a lot of work that's been happening on that end, right? To try to pull folks away from that. I think in another area is just like cops' abilities just to roam around and collect people's information and just pull them over. When you see them out on the streets as a young person, right? You tend to think, oh, you're gang involved. I need to fill out this FI card on you. I need to collect your name, your social security number, your phone, your address. I need all that stuff. Why is that even necessary? Sometimes you just have 3 students walking to school. They happen to be friends. They happen to be in an area that's not so great because that's where they live and they're just on their way. That doesn't mean they're up to no good. But automatically, because of the way things are enforced and the ways they're written, they're thought to be truant, right? You can talk about truancy laws now. You can talk about how things are penalized there and parents get involved and all kinds of stuff, right? There's a whole bunch of gaps. But I think ultimately the solutions are not in how we approach those things to find a solution, but it's how do we look at the folks that are being impacted by these issues to define the solutions, right? And then have support for that built up and to be put into the capital for folks to work on, right? Because I've seen in a lot of cases, we try to go and do stuff, or me in particular, and I'll get something like, I honestly had a cop tell us this in public. So I can tell they're a gang member by hearing their voice. Like, oh my God, really? You really think that? But they are empowered to do that because of the training that they're provided that comes from the state, right? Because of the way legislation and stuff, the way trailer bills and the way budget bills, right? So it's not always policy and legislation, but there's policies that are within the budget too. Like, what do you spend the money on? Do you choose to spend it on policing? Do you choose to spend it on schools? Do you choose to spend it on whatever, right? So there's so many broad impacts, but the criminalization of young people is a heavy one for us at YJC. But those things do come from the state, right? Whether it's school discipline, whether it's the ability for schools to have their own police departments. These are all things that are, authored by legislation, by statute, right? Because you're looking at young people as statutes. Again, goes back to this idea of a young person being a penal code and a WIC code, super voluntary probation, for example. Like, why did we ever have a system like that? Why did a young person that needed some help suddenly fall under the purview of probation guidance and support? Like, they need support. They don't need somebody with a badge as a peace officer to support, right? So there's all kinds of stuff. And I want to take us back to history for a second. Probation was started in California. It was designed to look after young people. But you got to remember that things were built for punitive measures, for certain benefits. So when it started going hayward, it started to pull back to every other system the same way. So it doesn't matter if we create something new, we try to start it up, we have to make sure that those things are implemented correctly and follow through. So whatever policy wins we do have, we have to be on top of it again. It's kind of pointless to get some good legislation put on the books and then just let it gather dust in a binder somewhere. All right, so that's very important for us. And since folks are here, I want to say academia has a very important role in that. Very, very important role. Academia can do something very great, but academia can also do a lot of harm. Right? I want to take us back to just one person, John DeLulio. If folks aren't familiar with him, read his book, Body Count. Created so much damage. And he later came out saying, man, I was wrong. But that's the ability that academia has. Academia has such powerful impact in these spaces to really move things in a proper direction. And so I just want to encourage folks from that space, from academics, to really think about the things that you're doing, the things that you're saying, the things that you're teaching, the reports you're publishing, the theses that you're writing. All of that matters. It all has impact, right? And so just want to leave folks with that piece.
Okay, so there's two areas I would like to touch on. One is the need to expand AB 12 eligibility. We see so many of our foster youth who, at 17, close to 18, they get involved with the juvenile justice system, and if they're placed in camp or Kirby on their 18th birthday, they will not be eligible for the extended foster care benefits till 21. These youth need it as much, if not more, than anyone else. It boggles my mind that you can take a youth that has so many needs and is struggling in so many ways, and you say, well, because you committed this act, we're not going to help you anymore. So that really, really needs to happen. I've had many phone calls from probation officers, several from camp. And one in particular, I remember this probation officer called me and said that this young man had gotten to camp and was a mess and had really turned things around, and, light switch went on, and he felt this kid was going to have a really good life. But he's worried about when he gets out of camp, because he had called the social worker, and the social worker said, well, I'm going to terminate his case. I'm going to terminate his case as quickly as possible. And the probation officer's like, is there anything you could do to help? So of course, I was able to call them, find out who represented the youth in my office, gave them the heads up. We were prepared for the recommendation to terminate. We fought it, and we were able to keep the youth in the system. But, it may not have happened if it had not been for that probation officer reaching out. So I really think that eligibility needs to be expanded. Camp and Kirby are just, it's a time limited thing. It's like if my daughter goes to probation camp for 6 months, she doesn't lose her home. She gets to come back to home. You know, our kids should be able to come back to DCFS. And then the other area that it's kind of stretching things a bit, but it's something that my unit has been really looking at are not only our 18 to 21-year-olds, but I'm going to even expand that to 26. And our clients, we only represent our clients until they're 21, but the 18 to, I want to say 26-year-old population, these are all the same science, brain development still applies to these youth, to these young adults, right? So we've had, you know, I have a client that we've had him since he was 10 years old. He's 18, never been in trouble, and is in county jail now for the first time. And so what I've learned about county jail is that kids that turned 18 a week ago are placed in a cell with, you know, 30, 40-year-old men. There is no services. We're getting mental health services, but I think he's been seen twice in 3 months, and very little else. I mean, and you know, he's not doing well. He's not surviving it well. So I'm really looking. I want to see this continue to expand. This reimagined. I know, you know, criminal justice system also needs to be tackled, but I would really like to see something done with those 18 to 20-something-year-olds, housing them separately from adults and still being able to provide services, since all the arguments as to why we do that for youth still apply to that age group. And we don't need to throw anybody away. Somebody had talked about that, and certainly not this age group either, because they still have great potential to move forward. So that's what I would share.
And just a final gap that I want to note is that so many of our dual status clients are actually involved in multiple systems. So we already know that they're involved in DCFS and probation, and those agencies don't talk to each other. Talking to each other at the 241.1 MDT, that's the extent of the conversation, and that is not enough. But so many of these kids are also involved in the special education system, the regional center system, the mental health system, the substance abuse system, and none of these agencies are talking to each other. And so you have a complete lack of service coordination. One thing we do at CLC is we try to get all those folks in the same room together and talk about how can we all support this youth in our own way that can work together harmoniously. We can all pitch in. There shouldn't be kids who are involved in 5 different systems and no one can figure out how to help them. So that lack of coordination amongst the multiple systems is a real problem that I see.
Thank you, everyone. I don't see any questions in the Q&A or the chat. If you do, participants, if you have questions, please put them there. If not, I'm wondering if anyone has anything to end us with. Maybe Megan or Sam have any concluding thoughts, and we can end a few minutes early. I believe that Sean Kennedy will have some closing remarks as well. No pressure.
I can go for a little bit here. You know, when I came home, it was after nearly 2 decades, right? I lost all my 20s to the system. You know, I turned 18 in court and other stuff, you know, but I didn't come out until like my mid-30s, actually getting to step out. And when I physically stepped out, you know, we call this the land of the free, freedom and opportunities, but I came out with an order of supervision from ICE. I came out with a deportation order in one hand, and I came out with an envelope that told me to report to parole office within 24 hours. That was my first breath in what we call the free world, the liberated world of America. So I just want folks to really gather that, and try to imagine that concept, imagine that feeling. But think about folks that go in young, and when they come back out, you know, what is that feeling like? You know, these are the things that we're putting people through by the systems that we've intentionally, unintentionally helped create one way or another, whether it's by us being quiet about things or whether on the other end, there's folks like engaging to make these systems the way they are, right? And so there's very real consequences. But, you know, my ability to stay here in the US today, it's because I got a pardon from Governor Brown in 2018. And it was only made possible because of the young folks at YJC. They gave me the space, they gave me that support, right? These are young folks giving me the support as an older person. But yet older people don't always give the young people support back in the same kind of love and fashion in that same way. But imagine if we reciprocated that to each other all the time, right? And that's all we're trying to get at. If we can get to that place, we can get to a place where we don't need cages. We don't need the concrete, and we don't need that rebar. We don't need those badges. You know, we don't need all of that. We're not even going to need a fence around the school, because students would love school. They'll love to socialize and be with their friends. It will be a productive space. And that's what we're trying to build, right? We're trying to get away from the models that we have today, which is just enforcing and, oh, if you're outside that gate, we're going to punish you, et cetera, right? That's not love and healing and care for our communities. And so that's my final thought for the day.
I offer just one concrete idea. Because I think sometimes when we look at the system as a whole, it gets really daunting. And it is, and it should be, but there's also, just from an individual case perspective, things that advocates can do. I think one of them is particularly for delinquency attorneys, remembering that the way that we've written our laws kind of makes you a dependency attorney all at the same time, always. So being that are happening from the state child welfare agency is really important. Like going through and reading the interagency coordinated practice model is really, really dry and horrible, but gives you a lot of leverage in bringing some of those agencies that we're talking about who never come to the table in, as does the joinder law that's written into the code. When the agency doesn't show up and do what they're supposed to do, the juvenile court is supposed to order them in. When you look at the CFT model, there's an entire website. This isn't a perfect option, but like there's an entire website on training about how to do this stirring space approach and who's supposed to be there and what that is supposed to be and what fidelity to that model looks like. It's not what you get, but it gives you a lot of instruction as to about what you should get court ordered. And I think I'll just give Brooke another plug, some of the motion work she's done to make some of those things happen can make critical differences in an individual case. And we've seen that in specific places. So going through and learning those things and making sure you've read all of them, even though they're so awful and dry, really important.
I'll jump in with another final thought and takeaway. And that is just always bringing us back to the positive, always shoring up the resilience. Even a kid who does something like brings a weapon to school when we go back to school, they showed up in school, you know, always finding something positive that we can focus on. And I think that's a really important takeaway in any setting that you find yourself in with anyone who we interact with. There's always opportunities to look for that. And I think we need to start looking for the positive and focusing on the positive and building up strengths.
Lastly, I'll say we need to make sure that we're prioritizing as a society things like education and rehabilitation, real rehabilitation, right? And not, you know, making things like our education system more like a prison. So that's something, you know, we really need to focus on. It shouldn't be going that direction. We should be getting rid of prisons, and we should be focusing on what real education should be, how to help our young people feel supported from the very beginning, and address their needs from the very beginning in that setting. And that means, you know, really fully funding schools and funding them based on the needs of the students in them, not based on the wealth of the community.
Thank you, everyone. Professor Kennedy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks for a great final panel, Brooke. I really appreciate it. This is really the end of our conference and supposedly the end of our project. It's been 3 years that the Everychild Foundation and Loyola Center for Juvenile Law and Policy have worked together on behalf of Crossover Youth, and Jackie as the foundation president, and more importantly, a youth justice advocate. I was just wondering if you had any final remarks.
Well, thank you, Sean. This has been an absolutely wonderful symposium, and it's definitely going to help move the needle forward on the outcomes for crossover youth. And if anything, it helped reveal why these kids need such specialized advocacy, especially when the various panelists describe some of the very preventable and tragic outcomes that result when the various advocates in the different systems don't communicate properly or work as a team. And it also revealed to me, however, how much more work needs to take place in terms of policies and systems to protect the rights of these youth. And I know all the women of Everychild are very grateful to each and every one of you for creating this very important and groundbreaking approach to helping the crossover population. And we very much look forward to it becoming more widespread as a result of these very important sessions over the past 2 days. Hopefully it will bring much more awareness to what you're doing. And we also hope that your very frank and thoughtful presentation is going to call more attention to the system deficits that still exist and will help lead to the necessary fixes. And as we just heard from the last panel discussion, there are many, many necessary fixes that need to take place. So thank you so much for allowing us at Everychild to play a role in making all of this possible. And I speak on behalf of our over 200 extremely generous women who were just thrilled to support this project. And we look forward to continuing to be your partner moving forward.
Thank you, Jackie. Although the project ends, the work continues. So we're going to continue battling it out on behalf of crossover youth. Like you, attending the sessions was a real eye-opener about how much work still needs to be done.
Yeah,
and I would,
you know, Sean, I served on the probation commission for the last 6 years, and it's been an exercise in great frustration. So it was very elucidating to hear, you know, so many people in the community share that frustration and help crystallize what some of these issues are.
Well, we're up to the task, because here we brought together all these different professionals and advocates, and we really come from different systems and different disciplines. And all the lawyers have different adjectives, you know, dependency, delinquency, educational, policy. But in the end, we all share the same commitment to these crossover kids and all the obstacles that they face as they navigate the system. And for me, this project, I mean, 3 years ago, Jackie, your organization and my organization had a vision. It was just an idea, and we had no idea what it would look like in the end. But I think all these 3 years of us working together with the help of CLC friends, we have really come a long way to helping crossover kids in LA County. And I think the way it's done is by all of us to keep doing this, to keep coming together, to keep working together, sharing strengths and weaknesses, collaborating, fighting it out, and trying to create a better, more high quality, more client-centered vision of the system of justice that we have. I want to thank all my colleagues at the Center for Juvenile Law and Policy and Lindsay Hinojosa for making this incredible virtual symposium in the middle of a pandemic happen. And finally, Jackie, I want to thank you and all the members of the Everychild Foundation who followed us through to the end in this vision of representation. I really appreciate your confidence in us. And I hope that the work will continue and that we will build and build and build on the project that we started 3 years ago.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So thank you, everyone. I hope we'll see each other real soon at another conference about collaborating and working together to help clients. Bye, Jackie. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, everyone.